The call came through on a broken channel, the static louder than the words. I could barely make out the panicked words through my earpiece. Something about another body found in one of the abandoned sectors of the colony. I didn't need the details, didn't want them. It wasn't the first corpse I'd seen, and it wouldn't be the last. I made my way through Asterin's Edge, the colony's corridors only wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Every step echoed dully on the rusted grates beneath my boots. The air had a bite to it, not from cold, but from the harsh tang of recycled oxygen mixed with traces of metal shavings. The medical bay door hung half open, stuttering on its hinges. A few of the miners hovered outside, trying to look like they didn't care but too scared to turn away. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, caught my eye and immediately looked down, fingers twitching at the frayed sleeve of his coverall. Fear was thick in this place, not just the kind that came from finding a dead body, but the deeper sort. The kind that seeped into your bones when you realized you were far beyond anyone's help. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind me with a groan of metal. The smell hit first, sharp, overlaid with the iron bite of blood. The room itself was small, barely lit. There on the center table lay the latest victim. The body was a mess of contradictions. Male, mid-30s, dressed in a worker's uniform like most of the colony residents. His throat had been opened with surgical precision, a clean incision that spoke of skill, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The vocal cords were gone, cut out with such care that there was almost no unnecessary damage, like they'd been the real prize and the rest of him was just packaging. His eyes were still open, wide. Not just the shock of death, but something deeper, a kind of frozen awareness that suggested he'd been alive when it happened, aware enough to know exactly what was being done to him. My stomach twisted, and I forced it down. He died staring at the ceiling, unable to scream, trapped in his own silence. Beside the body, on a tray stained with rust and blood, was the device. It looked like someone had taken apart half a dozen machines and jammed the pieces together, all pipes and strange tubes tangled in a mess that didn't belong. I reached out, stopping just short of touching it. I didn't have to be a tech expert to know this wasn't any standard piece of equipment. I watched the cylinder closely, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw it tremble slightly, like it was straining to catch any stray sound in the air. It felt hungry, waiting for the noise of a voice, a word, anything to devour and turn into something darker. I turned my attention back to the body, focusing on the details. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds. Whoever did this was methodical. I'd seen a lot of bodies, but this was different. And the worst part was realizing that this wasn't about killing. The murderer wasn't looking for blood. They were after something much more intangible. It was like they were stealing his last shred of humanity, trapping it in that damn machine for reasons I couldn't yet understand. I closed the man's eyes, a pointless gesture, but one I did anyway. Not for him, he was beyond caring. But for me. To shut out that stare. The whispers of old doubt started clawing at the back of my mind, the ones I'd buried after my partner lost his grip on sanity. Whispers about the madness in the stars, the things you could almost hear if you listened too closely in the silence of space. I told myself it was just paranoia, old wounds reopening at the worst possible time. But as I turned to leave, that cylinder vibrated again, and for the briefest second, I could have sworn I heard a hint of a scream caught in the back of my mind, trapped between existence and oblivion. I forced the door open and stepped back into the corridor, where the miners were still pretending not to care. One of them caught my eye, the kid from before, and I felt the unspoken question hanging between us, desperate and silent. "Another one," I said, voice flat. "Just like the others." The kid's face went a shade paler and he turned away, muttering something to himself. An officer stood nearby, his face set in the grim lines of a man who knows there's no good news coming. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough," I said. "And it's only going to get worse." I didn't wait for his reaction. There were more questions to ask, more shadows to chase in this place. And somewhere out there, the bastard who did this was still at work, harvesting silence from the throats of the damned. Astrin's Edge wasn't a place people ended up by choice. It was where they landed when all other roads closed, and the only thing left was a paycheck that barely covered the price of survival. As I walked through the heart of the colony, the remnants of its former life swirled around me. Half-functioning market stalls, traders bartering for broken tools and dried food, and miners hunched over with the thousand-yard stare of men who'd seen too much and still had to see more. A pair of workers dragged an ancient ventilation pipe across the cracked floor, their faces smeared with grease and frustration. They didn't look up as I passed, eyes fixed on their pointless task. The whole place reeked of desperation, and I knew better than to expect cooperation from the locals. Outsiders like me were about as welcome as another round of cut rations. My first stop was the colony's foreman, a guy named Kellen Bryce. He had been running the place since before the mining company cut ties and left this floating wreck to rot. He was built like a slab of iron ore, all hard angles and a demeanor that suggested he'd seen just about everything Astrin's Edge could throw at him. His office was a mess of half-empty liquor bottles and maps of the colony that looked about as outdated as his sense of optimism. He looked up from his desk as I entered, his expression a mix of irritation and resignation. "You find anything?" he asked, voice rough like gravel scraping against metal. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. "Depends what you mean by anything. Found another dead miner with his throat opened like a damn dissection project. Same precision, same missing vocal cords. Nothing else taken." Bryce's eyes flicked toward the bottle on his desk, fingers twitching like he was debating whether now was a good time for a drink. He didn't reach for it. "You think it's the Whisperers?" "Could be," I said, playing it neutral. "Word is they're getting more desperate." He grunted. "Desperate's one thing. Cutting out throats? That's something else entirely." "Tell me more about them," I said. "How do a bunch of miners end up slicing out their own voices for some cult?" Bryce's face tightened, and he rubbed a hand over his chin like he was scraping off years of regret. "They weren't always like this. Whisperers used to be regular folk until they started working the deep shafts. Something down there changed them. They came back, talking about the hum. Said they could hear something in the rock. Something that called to them when it was quiet enough. The hum," I repeated. "You think it's got something to do with that machine I found near the last body?" Bryce shrugged, a heavy movement that seemed to cost him. "Could be. All I know is they think they're onto some kind of truth that the rest of us can't hear. Truth worth bleeding for." I watched him closely, weighing his words. He was telling me the truth, or at least the version he believed in. The Whisperers weren't miners who'd cracked under pressure. They were people who'd been touched by whatever was buried in the depths of this rock. People who believed their silence held power. I thanked Bryce and left his office, heading deeper into the colony where the lights barely worked and the people watched you like they were calculating your worth in supplies. I needed to talk to someone who'd been closer to the mines, someone who'd touched the madness but still held on to enough sanity to string together a sentence. That's when I found Dr. Anna Harlow, the colony's medic. Her clinic was a converted storage unit, half the lights out, and walls covered in patched-up insulation. She was stitching up a miner's arm as I entered, her hand steady despite the shaking fluorescence. Without looking up, she said, "If you're bleeding, take a number. If you're not, stay out of my way." "Not bleeding," I said, leaning against the doorway. "Yet." She tied off the thread and finally looked at me, wiping her hands on a stained rag. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that saw more than she let on. "You're the one they called in to clean up our mess," she said. "Good luck. This place eats people like you." I gave her a thin smile. "Heard you've been down in the mines. Heard you might know a thing or two about the Whisperers." Harlow's face went blank for a moment, a mask dropping into place. "If you're asking whether I've seen men go mad down there, the answer's yes. I've treated enough of them to recognize the signs. Eyes like they're seeing something that's not there, muttering about the hum when they think no one's listening. "What do you think it is?" I asked. "What do they hear down there?" She hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But I've seen the damage it does. Not just to the body, but to the mind. People come back from the depths, altered. They lose parts of themselves down there. And that's what drives them to cut out throats?" I asked. She met my gaze, unflinching. "No, that's desperation. That's fear of something worse than death. I've seen men tear themselves apart to keep from hearing those whispers again." I left Harlow's clinic with more questions than answers, and a sense that whatever was happening here was far from simple. The miners, the machines, the whispers, it all connected, but the threads were tangled and bloodstained. I needed to get closer, to find someone who could give me more than scraps of half-truths. I headed for the deeper parts of the colony. It didn't take long to find the ex-scientist they called Mercer, a man who'd once been a leader in the colony's efforts to extract the minerals buried in Asterin's guts. Now he was just another ghost among the ruins, muttering to himself in the dark. Mercer's workshop was a cluttered cave of wires and broken equipment, the remains of a mind that once pursued knowledge and ended up trapped in madness. He looked up at me as I entered, eyes wild with a clarity that was more frightening than any madness I'd ever seen. "You're here about the murders," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Tell me about the machine, the one that's been showing up near the bodies." He gave a twitchy grin, half amused and half manic. "Ah, the machine. Beautiful, isn't it? They think it's just metal and gears, but it's more than that. It's a bridge, a link between us and the silence beyond." "What do you mean a bridge?" I demanded. "What is it doing to these people?" Mercer's grin faded, replaced by something darker. "It's not killing them. It's harvesting them. Their last breath, their final scream. It's not about death. It's about the sound of it, the silence after." "Why?" I asked, more shaken than I wanted to let on. "What's the point?" He leaned in closer, eyes fixed on mine with a feverish intensity. "The universe is a void, investigator, empty, indifferent. But there are things out there in the silence, things that hunger for more than just blood. They feed on fear, on the echoes of despair. And that machine, it's a tool to trap them, to keep them from hearing us scream." I left Mercer's workshop with his words rattling around in my skull, a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. The Whisperers weren't just a cult. They were believers in something older, something that lived in the silence. That made me wonder whether stopping the murders was really the right thing to do at all. Mercer's words stayed with me, lodged at the back of my mind. It's not killing them, it's harvesting them. I kept replaying those words as I made my way to the sector where the last body was found. The corridor extended before me, long and narrow, the metal walls warped from years of neglect. I reached the old processing room where the machine had been left behind, untouched since the last murder. In the middle of the floor sat that strange device again, its shape even more unsettling now that I knew what it might be capable of. I crouched beside the machine, studying it in detail. It was an unsettling fusion of old and new, parts that looked salvaged from the colony's failing tech mixed with components I'd never seen before. Wires looped and tangled like sinews, leading into what appeared to be a core chamber at its center, encased in a transparent shell. Inside that chamber, a black, liquid-like substance shifted sluggishly, as if it were resisting gravity's pull. The machine seemed to inhale the air around it, pulling in any trace of sound, creating a deep silence that felt like the air itself had been stripped of its voice. I couldn't leave it at that. I had to know what this thing really was. I pulled a small diagnostic scanner from my jacket, something the company had thrown in as standard issue. It wasn't much, but it could at least tell me if this thing was connected to any known technology. As I held it over the machine, the screen flared up. the readout spiking wildly, then glitching out. Static bled across the display, and then in a single line of text it read, "Unknown interference. Signal corrupted." I felt a sudden pressure in my ears, like when a storm front moves in too fast. Then I heard a whisper, leaking out from the machine's core. It wasn't a human voice. It was something layered, like multiple tones compressed into one sound. I jerked back, dropping the scanner. The whisper faded just as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the machine's silence. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew what I'd heard. It was like the echo of a scream, trapped within the device's mechanical guts. Mercer's talk of a bridge, a link to something that feeds on fear, felt less like the rantings of a madman and more like the grim truth. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, grounding myself in the reality of the floor under my feet. I needed answers, not from the ramblings of a man already broken by this place, but from someone who'd seen the same darkness and come out the other side. My mind was already on the whisperers as I made my way toward the lower sectors, the part of the colony where they hid, silent and unseen. The few workers I passed gave me a wide berth, their eyes moving to the ground or to anything that wasn't me. They knew better than to go looking into the places where the whisperers stayed. I found them gathered in what used to be a storage bay, now stripped down to the bare walls. They moved like a unit, their throats marked with crude scars where they'd mutilated themselves. None of them spoke, their eyes focused, like they saw through me to something worse beyond. One of them, a man whose face was caught in the flickering light overhead, approached, his head tilted slightly as if tuning in to a frequency I couldn't hear. His mouth opened, moving as though shaping words that never formed, lips parting in a silent litany that seemed more instinct than language. He didn't speak, he couldn't, but his eyes locked onto mine with a strange kind of calm, like he was already part of a conversation beyond my understanding. One of them, a man with a face half lit by the sputtering light above, approached me, his head tilted slightly, as though listening for something just beyond hearing. He raised his hand in a slow motion and pointed to the wall behind him, to a cluster of exposed wires, their insulation cracked and their copper guts visible, sparking intermittently. His fingers traced the damaged cables, moving over them with an almost reverent touch, as if they represented something sacred to him. I watched the short bursts of small, irregular sparks, each one briefly lighting up the hollows of his face, and I began to understand. These wires were a visual metaphor for the whisperers themselves, broken, disconnected from their purpose, stripped of their function. The man's gesture wasn't about the wires specifically. It was about what they stood for. Like the frayed cables that could no longer carry a signal, these men had severed their own ability to speak, to scream, to connect in any way that involved sound. They weren't insane. They had done this to align themselves with the silence they worshipped, to ensure that no voice, no noise, would ever betray them to whatever force they believed was listening from the darkness. I pulled my knife from its sheath, the weight of the steel grounding me in the here and now. This wasn't a time for soft touches. I grabbed the man by the front of his worn shirt and pressed the blade to the scarred skin of his throat, feeling the rough edges where his voice box had been crudely removed. "You know what I'm here for," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "What does that machine do and who's behind this?" The man's lips twisted into a silent smile, mocking and patient, like he knew something I didn't. His eyes held a calm certainty, the look of a man who had surrendered everything to a belief that was beyond pain or fear. He reached up, not to resist but to gently guide my hand away from his throat. Then he touched the frayed cables again, his fingers lingering on them like he was drawing a line between us and the reality they served, one where silence was more powerful than any scream. Behind me, the rest of the whisperers watched, their expressions unchanging, their eyes fixed on me as if they were witnessing a test I hadn't realized I was taking. It wasn't fear I saw in their faces. It was a deep, unwavering faith in something that eclipsed anything I could comprehend. They believed in their silence, believed it was a shield against whatever horror lurked just beyond human perception. I released my grip on the man's shirt, stepping back as he lowered his hand, that silent, knowing smile still on his face. From somewhere deep within the colony's guts, I felt a hum reverberating through the walls, trembling through the floor beneath my feet. It was like the machine itself had reached out, sending a signal that twisted the air around me. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a beacon, a lure drawing something in from the void, something that lived in the spaces between sound and silence. I left the Whisperer's den, my thoughts a storm of half-formed realizations. Mercer's theories, the machine's resonance, the fanatical devotion of these men who'd given up their voices to serve a belief that silence was their only defense. All of it pointed to one inevitable conclusion. The murders weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully orchestrated, a harvest of silence. Each victim's last breath was transformed into something else, an attempt to build a barrier against the madness creeping in from the stars. And if that was true, then the murderer was a visionary, convinced that he was humanity's last chance against the darkness clawing its way into our reality. If I was going to make sense of what was happening here, I had to confront the cult's leader, whoever was pulling the strings behind this silent devotion. My instincts told me that the key to understanding these murders lay with the one who had convinced those men to carve out their own voices in the first place. Word travels fast in a place like Asterin's Edge, where secrets are traded as currency and whispers are louder than gunshots. A few hushed conversations, some prodding, and I found my way to a section of the colony that even the miners avoided. A cavernous storage bay at the edge of the facility, dark and heavy with disuse. Inside, the Whisperers were gathered in a semicircle, their eyes closed, bodies swaying in a rhythm I couldn't hear. They moved like they were locked in communion with something unseen, faces lifted slightly, as though basking in the silence that suffused the room. And at the center of them stood a figure I hadn't seen before. Their leader. He looked more like a ghost than a man, his clothes hanging loose and worn, his throat marked with a scar that mirrored those of his followers. He approached me, raising his hand and tapping a small device strapped to his wrist, a piece of technology that looked too advanced for a place like Asterin's Edge. A soft chime sounded, and then his words appeared, projected as text into the air in front of him. "You seek answers, but you do not listen." There was something unsettling about this form of communication, a stark contrast between his mute body and the clarity of his message. I tightened my grip on my knife. "I came here for answers," I said, my eyes locked on his. "People are dying, their throats cut, their voices stolen. What do you know about it?" He tapped the device on his wrist again, and words began to materialize in the air between us. "These deaths are not random acts of violence. They are necessary sacrifices. You misunderstand our purpose." "Sacrifices?" I asked, the anger rising in my voice. "You're telling me these people were killed for some twisted cause? You steal their breath, their last scream, and you call it salvation?" The leader's lips twitched slightly, not quite a smile but close, like he was amused by my outrage. His fingers moved across the device again, and the words shifted. "Their final scream fuels the silence that protects us all. It is a necessary cost to wield the power that holds the darkness at bay." He gestured to the Whisperers surrounding him, their faces smooth and expressionless, like they'd already surrendered every part of themselves to whatever darkness he served. They didn't react, didn't even blink. They were empty vessels bound by a belief that seemed to have consumed their very essence. He tapped on his device, and a new line of text appeared. "We sever our own vocal cords to prevent any inadvertent sounds from corrupting the machine's purpose. Silence is not just a state, it is our discipline, our control. You believe this. You actually think you're saving the universe from something worse." His eyes blink, as if he were looking straight through me, beyond me, into the darkness he claimed to know so well. He tapped the device once more, his message slower this time. as if he was trying to make me see what he saw. The universe is not empty. It listens, it hungers. We are the dam that holds back the flood. I wanted to dismiss him, to tear apart his logic, to see him as just another madman lost to the dark. But the machine, the way it seemed to breathe with every heartbeat, every silent scream, I felt its presence, undeniable and getting stronger. The leader's eyes softened, almost pitying, as if he could already see the struggle inside me. He tapped the device again, his final words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Join us! Help us build the silence! It's the only way to keep the darkness from finding us." His hand stayed outstretched, not as a threat, but as an invitation into his world. A world where silence was the only weapon left to wield against the madness waiting beyond the stars. The Whisperers stood motionless, their expressions set in a kind of tranquil resignation, unflinching in their belief that they served a purpose beyond anything I could comprehend or destroy. I found myself staring into the eyes of a man who believed he was humanity's last hope. I didn't know if the knife in my hand was meant to defend myself, or if I was starting to understand why someone might willingly cut their own throat to join them. The murders weren't just acts of violence. They were messages sent into the void like flares. Each one was a desperate attempt to keep the darkness at bay, to hold back something worse than death. The cult leader's hand remained outstretched, that same offer hanging in the air between us. Behind him, the Whisperers stood motionless, their devotion carved into the hollows of their silent throats. I was on the brink, teetering between disbelief and the fear that he might be right, that this nightmare was the only defense we had against something worse. I couldn't allow myself to fall into that void. I couldn't let go of the part of me that still believed there was another way. "You're coming with me," I said, the knife now a trembling extension of my desperation. "We'll put an end to this madness, one way or another." I charged at him, intending to restrain him and bring him back to the colony's authorities if necessary. We grappled on the floor, our struggle a clash of willpower and inevitability. My knife caught his arm, drawing a thin line of blood, but he twisted free, his face calm, as if the pain was just another fleeting echo of his past humanity. He drove his elbow into my ribs and I felt something give, a sharp pain lancing through my side like a hot wire. I backed away, holding my side, blood seeping through my fingers, my eyesight clouded, with dark patches shifting around the borders. Yet I pushed myself to stay focused. I had to end this here, now, before the darkness swallowed me. He made his move, a sharp twist of his wrist, pulling out a piece of metal from his belt, a makeshift blade, rough and ugly but lethal in his hands. He drove it into my side with a precision that left no doubt this was meant to be my end. I gasped, the air leaving my lungs in a burst, my legs giving way as I collapsed to the ground. Pain flared through my body, but worse than the pain was the cold, a creeping numbness that infiltrated my core, signaling this was the end. The Whisperers moved around me, not with the urgency of killers, but with the careful reverence of priests tending to a ritual. The leader knelt beside me, his face close to mine, the blue glow of his wrist device casting a stark light on his features. He tapped out a message, the words hanging in the air like a final verdict. "Your scream will save us all." I tried to fight, tried to gather my strength to at least spit in his face, but my body was failing me. The Whisperers dragged the machine over, its core chamber shifting, that black liquid inside rolling with a slow rhythm. The leader pressed something cold to my throat, a device that forced the air from my lungs, squeezing it out as if milking my last breath. They wanted my scream. I felt the machine react to the sound building in my chest, the edges of its core darkening, that viscous black substance within churning faster as it waited to consume my final act. My scream wasn't just a sound. It was my fear, my defiance, my utter betrayal of the logic I had clung to. And they were right there, ready to catch it, to turn my last breath into another barrier against the unknown. In that last moment as my scream tore free, a raw, broken thing stripped from the deepest part of me, the machine latched onto it. The black liquid inside seized the sound, twisted it, transformed it into something more than a mere vibration. It became a weapon, a fragment of despair distilled into silence, adding to the unholy resonance that would hold back the horrors waiting in the dark. And as the world dimmed around me, the leader leaned closer, the device on his wrist sending one final message. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Welcome to the silence. My vision faded, the last of my screams swallowed by the machine, now a part of the mechanism that stood between humanity and the things that lurked beyond. I understood then what they'd known all along, that survival wasn't about fighting the darkness. It was about feeding it just enough of our fear, our pain, to keep it at bay. I died knowing that I hadn't stopped the murders, that I'd become one of them. A voice forever trapped in the silence, a scream eternally bound to the machine that would keep screaming long after I was gone. And in that silence, I felt a twisted kind of peace, knowing that my last breath had become part of the last line of defense against the endless, listening void.